For months, military analysts in Washington and Brussels have been quietly refusing to say one thing out loud. Ukraine may be winning in the south. Tonight we ask, what has changed to prompt such a dramatic reassessment of the war's trajectory? Something is happening in southern Ukraine right now that most of the world's media has not properly covered. Something that, if it continues at its current pace, will change the fundamental equation of this entire war. Russian forces in the Zaporizhzhia direction are not simply losing ground. They are losing the narrative that justified every sacrifice, every mobilization wave, every economic contraction Russia has endured since February 2022. And at the center of this story is a single highway, 600 kilometers long, stretching from the Russian mainland all the way into occupied Crimea. That highway is the M14. And as of this week, in May 2026, it is no longer safe. Ukraine has brought it under fire control. The vital artery through which troops, fuel, ammunition, air defense systems, and food all pass is now being hunted by Ukrainian drones operating well over 100 kilometers behind the front line. The Kremlin spent years building this corridor. It took one drone campaign to make it a liability. But before we get into what is happening right now on those roads, we need to understand exactly why Zaporizhzhia became the most consequential front in this war. Because if you understand Zaporizhzhia, you understand everything. You understand why Russia is bleeding its elite airborne divisions dry, trying to hold a steppe town called Huliaipol. You understand why the Kremlin is willing to slow down its main offensive in Donetsk just to protect the south. The front line in Ukraine today stretches approximately 1,000 kilometers from the Kharkiv region in the northeast all the way down to the Kherson bank of the Dnipro River. Russia currently controls roughly 18% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. This figure, while seemingly substantial, masks a critical vulnerability. Unlike historical occupations where territorial control equated to strategic stability, Russia's hold here is increasingly tenuous, reliant on vulnerable supply lines rather than consolidated local support or robust infrastructure. Fighting continues along this front, with Russian forces maintaining control of significant portions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson oblasts, as well as Crimea. But raw territorial percentages conceal more than they reveal. What matters is not how much land Russia holds. What matters is whether Russia can afford to keep holding it. And in the south, that calculation is shifting. Crimea has always been the crown jewel of Putin's military gamble. He annexed it in 2014 with minimal resistance and presented it to the Russian public as proof of national greatness, a historic correction of what he called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. For over a decade, Crimea functioned as a symbol, proof that Russia could act boldly, defy the West, and face no lasting consequences. Then came February 2022, full-scale invasion. Then suddenly Crimea was no longer a symbol. It became a logistics hub, a staging ground, a base for naval operations in the Black Sea, and critically a territory that Russia now had to feed, fuel, and defend from a peninsula with extremely limited access routes. The Kerch Bridge, that famous 19-kilometer structure Putin personally inaugurated in 2018, was damaged in October 2022 and again in July 2023. Ukraine demonstrated very early that it could reach that bridge. Russia responded by routing more and more of its critical supplies through the M14 highway overland. The logic was straightforward. If the bridge becomes unreliable, the land corridor absorbs the load. What Russia never adequately planned for was a scenario in which Ukraine could threaten both simultaneously. That scenario is now here, and it did not arrive overnight. It arrived through a carefully sequenced series of military operations that began taking shape in January 2026 and accelerated dramatically through April and May. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, despite mounting pressure, Ukrainian forces have not only contained Russian assaults, but have also conducted localized counterattacks. Particularly near Huliaipol and Oleksandrivka, what began as defensive holding actions has evolved into something far more ambitious. The same front that Russia's military planners selected for their winter breakthrough attempt has instead become the site of Ukraine's most significant territorial recovery in months. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to the Russian plan for the winter of 2025 into 2026. Moscow's strategy was clear. Push deep in Zaporizhzhia, encircle Ukrainian positions, create northward pressure toward the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, and use gains on this axis to pressure Kyiv into diplomatic concessions. Russian forces carried out deep infiltration attempts in January and February 2026, pushing toward Vasilivka and Orikhiv, achieving small but dangerous tactical gains. The Kremlin's propaganda machine presented these as successful buffer zone operations, but Ukraine was already planning its response. By late February, the operational picture had become considerably less dramatic for Moscow. Reviewing the first 2 months of the year, Ukrainian military analyst Oleksandr Kovalenko assessed that Russian forces had effectively failed to achieve the goals of their winter offensive. And the reason they failed is a story of Ukrainian operational planning that deserves far more attention than it has received. The Ukrainian General Staff made a decision that reveals exactly how much their doctrine has matured since 2022. Rather than reacting to Russian infiltrations with improvised defenses, they prepared a counterstrike. The 148th Artillery Brigade of the Air Assault Forces was redeployed from the Pokrovsk sector in Donetsk. Equipment was moved quietly. Routes were carefully selected to avoid drone surveillance. Soldiers were not told what was coming. Secrecy was paramount. Not even some of the high-ranking commanders who would be taking part knew of Ukraine's upcoming counterattack in southeastern Ukraine. Think about what that means operationally. In an era where every road is monitored, every field is observed, and every vehicle is a potential drone target, Ukraine managed to assemble a significant assault force without Russia detecting it until Ukrainian units appeared behind their positions. That is not luck. That is discipline, planning, and a level of operational security that Russia's own commanders have openly admitted they cannot match. The results of that secrecy, of that patience, of that calculated restraint are now visible on the battlefield maps. The Institute for the Study of War assessed on March 9th that compounding pressure across multiple sectors was forcing the Russian command to make operational and strategic level decisions in response to what began as local tactical setbacks. The Institute for the Study of War also assessed that the Russian command had laterally redeployed elite VIDV and naval infantry from Donetsk Oblast to the south in response to Ukrainian gains in the Oleksandrivka and Huliaipol directions. A shift that may compromise the anticipated spring-summer 2026 offensive against Ukraine's fortress belt. Read that again. Russia is cannibalizing its main offensive axis to defend the south. That is not the behavior of an army that believes it is winning. So Russia is pulling its best units southward, leading its Donetsk offensive to plug holes in Zaporizhzhia. But what exactly did Ukraine do to force that redeployment? What was the operation that broke Russia's confidence in the south? Because this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable and where the details coming out of Kyiv's independent frontline reporting reveal a level of military sophistication that most mainstream coverage has completely ignored. The operation that changed the Zaporizhzhia dynamic was conducted at the intersection of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts, in a stretch of territory where Russian forces had been quietly consolidating since late 2025. They were digging in, fortifying, preparing to make their gains permanent. Ukraine decided to deny them that permanence. And the way Ukraine executed this denial is one of the most instructive military stories of this entire war. Around 2 weeks before the counterattack kicked off in late January, the 148th Artillery Brigade was tasked with destroying the Russian artillery units that could devastate Ukrainian infantry trying to advance on the border between Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. This was the foundation of the entire plan. You do not send infantry forward into contested ground while the enemy's artillery is still operational and zeroed in on your approach routes. You destroy the artillery first, silently, methodically at night, using drones, working in tandem with Caesar howitzers and 777 155mm guns. Then, and only then, do you move. Only around 10 people out of more than 2,000 in the 148th Brigade were informed about the operation approximately 2 weeks prior. The brigade's head of reconnaissance, who goes by the call sign Abrams, stressed that everything needed to be done as discreetly and quickly as possible. Even the possibility that soldiers' online contacts could be Russian intelligence operatives fishing for information was factored into the operational security plan. This is the level of paranoia, the healthy, disciplined, professional paranoia that Ukraine has developed after 4 years of fighting one of the world's most surveillance-intensive conflicts. Every conversation is a potential leak. Every vehicle movement is a potential signal. And so Ukraine moved in silence in small groups, using routes that bypassed known Russian drone corridors, letting fog and darkness serve as force multipliers. Russian troops did not expect the offensive at all. According to Ukrainian commanders on the border of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts, a thorough reconnaissance was conducted prior to the mission, detecting signs of human activity such as trash left on the ground. Minimizing direct firefights between the infantry was the goal, with commanders giving troops the green light once drone teams had provided the all-clear. And once those assault groups moved forward, they did not simply push through the front line. Some units crept as far as 3 kilometers into the Russian rear, cutting off reinforcement and retreat routes simultaneously. Russia's soldiers found themselves surrounded, not by a massive mechanized assault they could detect from kilometers away, but by small, fast, lethal Ukrainian units that had emerged from nowhere. That is the new face of ground warfare in this conflict, and Russia has not developed an effective answer to it. The results were concrete and verifiable. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky both publicly acknowledged the success of this operation. Zelensky claimed Ukraine had liberated over 400 square kilometers of Russian-occupied territory in the east of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts as of March, thwarting Moscow's anticipated effort to consolidate its winter gains before the ground hardened further in spring. 400 square kilometers. That is not a skirmish. That is a strategic reversal, and it happened while most of the world's media was focused on Pokrovsk, on Kursk, on the diplomatic back and forth between Washington and Moscow. In the south, quietly, deliberately, Ukraine was reclaiming ground that Russia thought it had permanently secured. Now, here is where the strategic picture expands into something far larger than a single counterattack. Because what Ukraine did on the ground in late January and February was only half the operation. The other half, the part that is genuinely terrifying for Russian military planners, is what Ukraine is doing to the roads. The Institute for the Study of War noted a rise in geolocated Ukrainian medium-range strikes in early 2026. Its April assessment cited evidence of increasing strike activity against Russian forces and assets in eastern and southern Ukraine, including targets linked to logistics and preparations for offensive operations. Those strikes are not random. They are not opportunistic. They form a coherent, systematic campaign designed to make every major supply route in occupied southern Ukraine dangerous, unpredictable, and economically costly to use. Consider what Ukraine's drone forces have actually achieved in this campaign. Ukrainian Hornet drones are flying in pairs over the Mariupol section of the R-150 route seeking targets, primarily tankers and other military transport. According to Russian Z blogger Romanov, writing on his Telegram channel, the R-150 route through Mariupol was until very recently one of Russia's most secure rear-area logistics corridors. It runs deep behind the front line, far from where Ukraine was previously able to project force. The fact that Ukrainian drones are now patrolling it in pairs, hunting fuel tankers at will, represents a fundamental shift in the operational geography of this war. There is no longer a safe rear for Russian logistics in the south. There's only varying degrees of danger. Ukrainian drone strikes on the Donetsk-Mariupol and Melitopol-Mariupol roads are increasing. These roads are the backbone of Russian forces in the south, and Ukrainian forces have demonstrated the ability to strike around occupied Mariupol from a distance of roughly 160 kilometers. When Ukrainian drones can reach 160 kilometers consistently, the implications for the M14 highway specifically become severe. The M14 runs through Mariupol, through Berdyansk, through Melitopol, all the way to the administrative boundary of Crimea. For the entire length of that corridor, Russian convoys must now move, knowing that a drone could be overhead at any moment. They must move at night, they must disperse, they must carry electronic warfare equipment, they must travel with air defense assets covering the convoy from above. Every one of those requirements costs time, money, fuel, and manpower that Russia simply cannot afford to waste. If Ukraine can now strike consistently at 160 to 200 kilometers, regular drone attacks would make movement slower, less predictable, and more dependent on concealment, electronic warfare, air defense cover, and nighttime transport. For the Russian command, the issue is not only the destruction of individual vehicles or sections of road. The deeper issue is what economists call friction. Every layer of additional complexity added to a logistics chain reduces its throughput. Convoys that once moved freely in daylight now travel at night in dispersed formations with electronic countermeasures active. Journey times double. Fuel consumption increases. Maintenance schedules collapse. The front line receives less, later, and in worse condition than before. And that is without Ukraine destroying the road itself, fire control alone. The credible threat of being struck is enough to begin degrading the system in which most tactical movement is detected by a constant drone presence overhead and then attacked. This drone zone concept is one of the most consequential military innovations of this war, and it is Ukraine, not Russia, that has mastered its application. Russia has drones too. Russia has electronic warfare assets deployed throughout the theater. But Ukraine is the side that has successfully extended its drone zone from the tactical front line all the way into what were previously secure operational depth logistics areas. That expansion from the frontline trenches to a reach of 160 kilometers and beyond happened in a matter of months, and it is not finished expanding. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that the Kremlin will likely need to either abandon or substantially adjust previous plans for its spring-summer 2026 offensive either in Donetsk Oblast or in Zaporizhzhia, because the forces allocated to that offensive are already being consumed defending against planned spring offensive. Both have been disrupted by an opponent that refused to fight on Russia's chosen timeline, in Russia's chosen locations, at Russia's chosen tempo. Ukraine is not fighting the war Russia planned. It is fighting the war Russia feared. We have established what Ukraine did on the ground. We have established what Ukraine is doing to the roads. Now we need to talk about what Ukraine is doing to the destination itself. Because the drone campaign against the M14 highway is not the endpoint of the strategy. It is the opening move. The real target, the target that keeps Russian military planners awake at 3 in the morning, is Crimea itself, not its liberation through a ground assault. Something far more methodical, far more sustainable, and in many ways far more devastating. Ukraine is attempting to sever every artery feeding the peninsula one by one until the cost of holding Crimea becomes higher than any political calculation can justify. Let us talk about what happened on the night of May 5th into May 6th, 2026. Ukrainian drone strikes hit multiple Russian targets in and around occupied Crimea. An S-400 air defense launcher was struck, 2 mobile fire group vehicles were destroyed, 1 Russian soldier was killed, and 10 were wounded in the initial strikes. But the main blow, the strike that carries the heaviest strategic weight, landed on the Dzhankoy railway junction. 5 Russian soldiers were killed, 5 more were wounded. A locomotive was destroyed. Several freight wagons were damaged. Now you might read those numbers and think that sounds manageable. A locomotive and a few wagons? How significant can that really be? The answer is enormously significant because Dzhankoy is not just a train station. As part of an operation conducted in April 2026, Ukrainian Defense Intelligence Special Forces carried out 5 strikes directly targeting enemy freight trains in motion, destroying enemy locomotives used to transport military equipment and fuel and a tanker. Dzhankoy is Crimea's central railway distribution hub. Every military shipment that arrives in the peninsula via the Kerch Bridge is sorted and rerouted from that junction to Sevastopol, to Simferopol, to the coastal naval bases in the south. Destroy the junction and you do not just stop one train. You back up the entire railway network of the peninsula. You create delays measured not in hours but in days. And in a wartime logistics system already operating under severe strain, days of delay at a central hub can cascade into ammunition shortages, fuel deficits, and rotation failures at the front. The strikes on Dzhankoy followed a pattern that Ukrainian forces have been developing and refining throughout early 2026. Small-scale drone raids using FPV drones and longer-range strike systems have been probing Crimea's air defenses repeatedly, systematically, almost surgically. Each raid tests a slightly different approach vector. Each raid identifies gaps in Russia's electronic warfare coverage and air defense umbrella. And each raid that penetrates deeper than the last demonstrates something critical. Crimea's air defenses are being degraded. By early 2026, roughly 30% of Russia's Black Sea fleet had been destroyed or seriously damaged, according to Ukraine's defense ministry, forcing Moscow to pull key assets away. This attrition rate is unprecedented for a major naval power in modern warfare, especially against an adversary with no conventional navy. It highlights Ukraine's innovative asymmetric tactics, effectively neutralizing a significant portion of Russia's maritime projection capabilities through drones and missiles, a strategic shift from traditional naval engagements. Then came the night of May 13, 2026. Ukrainian drones struck the Taman seaport in Russia's Krasnodar region directly across the Kerch Strait from Crimea. The targeted area near the settlement of Volna hosts one of Russia's key fuel and energy logistics hubs on the Black Sea coast. The Taman gas terminal, part of the OCO group operating in the port of Taman near Cape Zhelezny Rog. The facility plays a major role in Russian oil exports and logistical support for the Russian Black Sea Fleet due to its proximity to the Crimean Bridge and occupied Crimea. NASA satellite fire monitoring data confirmed the blaze at approximately 2:54 in the morning, more than half an hour before Russian authorities even acknowledged an incident had occurred. 3 fuel storage silos caught fire. The terminal, which feeds directly into the logistics chain, sustaining both Russia's naval presence and its ground forces in Crimea, was struck at the very point where supplies crossed from the Russian mainland toward the peninsula. Overnight, drone strikes hit both sides of the Kerch Strait simultaneously. The bridge remained standing, but the infrastructure feeding into and out of it was burning. And then on the morning of May 13th, something happened that confirmed just how acute the pressure on this corridor has become. In the temporarily occupied Crimea, drone flights and powerful explosions were reported overnight on May 13th, and the Kerch Bridge was closed to traffic. The Kerch Bridge, Russia's most heavily defended single piece of infrastructure in the entire theater, was closed. Authorities decided the risk of traffic crossing it outweighed the cost of halting movement entirely. Think about the significance of that decision. Every hour that bridge is closed, every convoy that cannot cross, every train that sits waiting at Taman for the all-clear is an hour of supplies not reaching Russian forces in Crimea and on the southern front. Russia closed its own lifeline because Ukraine made the environment around it too dangerous to use freely. Ukraine's naval forces reportedly struck patrol boats guarding the Kerch Bridge crossing, and military analysts noted that no matter what kind of layered defenses the Russian military may have there, Ukraine's military will find a combination of systems and tactics to take that on. That assessment from analysts tracking Ukrainian unmanned systems development reflects something important about the trajectory of this campaign. Ukraine is not trying to destroy the Kerch Bridge in a single dramatic strike. It is systematically dismantling the defensive ecosystem around the bridge, eliminating the patrol boats, testing the air defense coverage, striking the port facilities on both sides until the bridge stands exposed, overextended, and off coastline through Mariupol and Melitopol are becoming increasingly vulnerable to Ukrainian drone attack. Ukraine has been steadily increasing the depth of its drone zone, an area beyond the front line in which most tactical movement is detected by a constant drone presence overhead and then attacked. This is the convergence that Russian military planners are confronting right now in May 2026. The M14 highway is under fire control. The railway routes through Mariupol and Melitopol are under drone surveillance and being struck with increasing regularity. The Taman fuel terminal is burning. The Dzhankoy railway junction has been hit multiple times. The Kerch Bridge has been closed to traffic under threat. And Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the force that was supposed to guarantee Crimea's maritime security, has lost nearly a third of its total strength. What Ukraine is executing here is not improvised. It is doctrine. It reflects months of planning and a clear strategic theory of victory that does not require liberating Crimea through a frontal ground assault, an operation that would be extraordinarily costly and would carry genuine risks of nuclear escalation. Instead, Ukraine is pursuing what military theorists call interdiction at depth. You do not need to capture the peninsula. You need to make it impossible for Russia to supply it, reinforce it, and sustain a credible military presence there at an acceptable cost. The Institute for the Study of War has assessed that Russia's strategic narrative is increasingly decoupled from its battlefield reality. And nowhere is that decoupling more visible than in Crimea, where Putin's rhetoric of ironclad control stands in direct contradiction to a peninsula whose supply lines are being systematically dismantled from the outside. The Russian public is beginning to sense this contradiction. Russian Z-bloggers, the military commentators who function as an unofficial bellwether of mood inside the pro-war community, are openly expressing alarm. Among Russian observers, Ukrainian drone operations over southern supply routes are provoking serious concern about the future of supplies to units fighting on the southern front. When the pro-war bloggers start sounding worried, you know the pressure is real. These are not independent journalists. These are people whose entire identity is built around projecting confidence in Russian military power. When they begin acknowledging that the rear is not secure, that convoys are being hunted, that electronic warfare systems cannot keep pace with Ukrainian drone evolution, they are not being brave. They are being overwhelmed by a reality they can no longer spin. So where does all of this lead? And what is the endgame of everything we have just walked through together? The secret counterattack in Zaporizhzhia, the drone campaign over the M14, the strikes on Dzhankoy, the burning terminal at Taman, the closed Kerch Bridge. Is this the beginning of Crimea's liberation? Is this the moment the war turns decisively? The honest answer requires both clarity and caution, because what Ukraine is doing right now is not yet a victory. It is the construction of the conditions for one, and understanding the difference between those two things is what separates serious strategic analysis from wishful thinking. Retired analysts and defense institutions who have studied this conflict most carefully have converged on a consistent conclusion. The path to resolving Crimea does not run through a beachhead landing or a mechanized thrust across the Perekop Isthmus. It runs through logistics, it runs through economics, it runs through the slow, grinding, mathematically inevitable process of making the cost of occupation exceed the Kremlin's capacity and political willingness to bear it. Such attacks are unlikely to sever the land corridor by themselves. Roads can be repaired, convoys can be dispersed, and Russian forces retain alternative supply routes. However, regular drone attacks would make movement slower, less predictable, and more dependent on concealment, electronic warfare, air defense cover, and nighttime transport. That assessment from Defense Matters is correct and important. Ukraine is not collapsing Russia's southern logistics overnight. It is imposing a tax on every single movement, every single convoy, every single supply run that compounds over weeks and months into an unsustainable operational burden. Consider the asymmetry of this cost exchange. Ukrainian Hornet drones and FPV systems cost thousands of dollars per unit. The Russian fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, S-400 launcher components, and locomotives they are destroying cost millions. This stark economic imbalance is a game changer, allowing Ukraine to inflict disproportionate damage on Russia's high-value military assets with relatively inexpensive, mass-produced drones. It represents a fundamental shift in the cost-benefit analysis of modern warfare, favoring the agile innovator over the traditional industrial power. Ukrainian drone manufacturers can quickly adjust designs based on direct frontline feedback. While large-scale production helps Kyiv sustain the tempo of mid-range and deep strike operations at a lower cost,